in your experience, what's the best way to go out to build a compelling business case, either for someone like me who's trying to sell a product into the accessibility space, or for someone within the organization who's trying to get buy-in from their leaders?
Hmm. It really depends on who you're talking to. If we're talking to leaders, the conversation is different than if we're talking to, say, frontline workers, developers, designers, or whatnot.
Right.
So if we focus on the leaders and how the conversation is framed around those folks, I would say that one of the main areas to discuss are probably related to the legal landscape, what it is that they have in terms of legal obligations, for instance. So you're
Okay.
based in Toronto, so you're on Ontario. Ontario has the
Yep.
AODA,
Oh yeah.
Accessibility
Yep.
for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. So there's an actual law in Ontario that forces businesses, that makes sure that businesses are accessible. It's not just the government or the public sector, it's also the private sector in this case. So if a business, if an organization does business in Ontario, for instance, if they're Canadian, that becomes a very significant part of our conversation. Did you know that there are laws that actually mandate you to do this? So this, regardless of the fact that you think it's relevant or not, there's a law for this.
Right.
It's been around for almost 20 years now. It came
Yep.
in 2005. So that's one aspect of it. If my clients are American, which a lot of them are, then we're talking about the accessible, the
ADA.
ADA, the
Yeah.
Americans with Disabilities Act, and how that is being leveraged for over 4,500 lawsuits every year, based on research that is done by Usable Net every year. So again, there's this legal landscape that you want to like paint a portrait of,
Okay.
so that people understand that. So that's one piece of it, and that would be the stick, right? The carrot
Yeah.
on the other end, which the much more interesting conversation for business owners, is to say, hey, you realize what market we're talking about here. So I mentioned earlier in our conversation that 27% of the population has a disability or self-identifies as such. That's true both in Canada and the US, based on the data from Statistics Canada and also from the CDC in the United States. So we happen to be at the very same level in terms of that prevalence. And when you look at the after-tax disposable income of people with disabilities in Canada, according to the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, that's $55 billion a year. If you look at the United States, where they have roughly 9 times more people than we do, according to the American Institutes of Research, their after-tax disposable income for people with disabilities is $504 billion a year. So it's a huge, untapped, underserved market to begin with. So if you build products, if you have services that are accessible to those folks, you have a potential of clients that you can work with that are usually not serviced really well, or that struggle with using products. So you can differentiate yourself that way. But it's not just about the potential of the potential of that market per se. It's also people who gravitate around those folks. Like there's a book actually written by Rich Donovan, also from Toronto, called Unleash Different. And in that book, he makes the case for what he calls the disability market. And the disability market being people with disabilities, but also their loved ones, people
Right.
that care about them, their colleagues, their families, like people that are revolving around those folks. And that comes up to 53% of the global market. So more than half of the global market can be swayed one way or another based on whether you are inclusive or not, or whether you are leaving people behind or not. So from the perspective of, and that brings us into a different aspect of that conversation, which is, or that business case, which is really to talk about the perception of the public with regards to your business or your organization. There are dozens of examples out there on Google. It's very easy to find. I'm not going to name names, but it's very easy to find organizations whose names have been seriously, or reputation has been seriously damaged because they pushed back on accessibility
Right.
claims that were made for them. Some of them going as far as 20 years ago, and that we still name today as examples of what not to do when someone asks about accommodations on
Right.
websites or whatnot. So the reputational risks are also a huge part of that business, building that business case. If we go back to money, the other thing also that's interesting is that we keep thinking about disability or accessibility as being for people with disabilities. But once you start broadening that up, you realize very quickly that our aging population, and by that I don't just mean the seniors, but I mean anyone who's in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and eventually considered more of a senior, our senses do deteriorate with time. And anyone who's old enough listening to this will realize or already knows that, you know, your vision, your hearing, your ability to sustain a cognitive effort over time, your dexterity, all these things start, you know, going down with time. So when you create accessible products, accessible websites, those websites are also easier to use for you as someone who does not identify with a disability but still has issues compared to how they would have behaved 20 years before. So in that group, when you just look at the again, I don't have the details for the US, but I remember Canada here. When you look at the after-tax disposable income of folks over the age of 65 in Canada, it's over $218 billion a year. So again, we're going back to this market, this really big potential
Right.
market that you can leverage or tap into more when you pay attention to accessibility. So, and then on top of that, of course, there are things like, you know, making the case around, you know, an improved user experience that you would have. If it's more accessible, it's easier to use for everyone. So, I mean, like, there's not a day that goes by where I don't hear about someone, you know, complaining about how difficult a website is to use because of accessibility
Yep.
barriers. But I've yet to hear about anyone complaining that a website was too easy to use, that they wish it had been more complicated. That doesn't happen.
No, it
And when you
doesn't. Yeah.
create a website that is accessible, or like an application or a document or whatnot, and it works really well and smoothly, a lot of it has to do with accessibility. Like if you create these accessibility features or add them to your products, it's going to make a better experience as a result of that, therefore helping everyone in the process. And I mean, there's a lot of other things we can talk about. I mean, innovation is an example of that. When we look into, you know, if we bring it back to the workplace, for instance, if you have a bunch of people in your workforce that are all basically the same, let's say they were all, you know, white males, for instance, they may be really good at what they do, but their perspective is limited by their own understanding and their own reality, their own culture. So when you start diversifying your team and you bring more people to it, you have different perspectives that can come together, and then that brings more creativity, more innovation, more ideas to solve problems. So all those things are examples of what we can talk about in terms of creating like building a business case around inclusion.
Okay. I'm glad you brought up the market example on how big or how large the market size is. I mean, if you know, because you're right, it's not just people with disabilities. If you look at the extension of family members, friends, supporters, it's a really big market, and that's one of the, I would say, one of the myths or things that a lot of misunderstanding around accessibility is that, hey, it's a small niche market, and you know, it's not worth your time. And yes, if it weren't for the compliance, like, you know, people wouldn't do it. What are some other myths you've heard, you know, from business leaders around accessibility?
Well, the fact that accessibility is a small or insignificant market is certainly a big one that we hear about all the time. I mean, I've spoken to that already, so I'm not going to go back to these things, but it is clearly something that we sort of run against all the time. Another significant one would be that, you know, accessible websites are boring, as an example. That's like one we hear about quite a bit too.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is founded in some truth. If you go back, you know, 20 years ago,
Yeah.
an accessible website was a website without any pictures. It was just
Yeah.
text, black text on a white background. So it
Yeah.
was like text based, not very interesting.
Mhm.
But I mean, it's been years since you can create a very like immersive, interesting, visually exciting, appealing interface and different services within or features within that interface that can still be made to be accessible from the very beginning. So and we have great examples out there with Microsoft and Apple and other big companies like that who've invested in creating more accessible products. Salesforce is another example. I mean, none of them are perfect, but a lot of them are leading the way in a lot of ways in terms of showing that these things are possible. So, you know, that myth is one that we see quite a bit as well. Another one might be related to the fact that, a surprisingly high number of business owners will say, yeah, but blind people don't come to our website. So people with disabilities don't come to our
Right.
website. And my first thought is always, how do you know? I mean, did you ask
I know.
anyone? Like, what's your
Yeah.
like? Is it a gut feeling? Because
Hmm.
and even if that was true, why aren't they coming? Is it because what you provide is not interesting to them, or is it because that there are so many barriers that they can't even do it? Should they want to? And when you think about it, you know, whether you sell a product or a service, and a lot of people will say that. Like, let's say, for instance, you could have a shoe company. Um, pick any brand that you like running shoes, for instance, and you could say, well, blind people don't run. Why would I
Right.
ever want to
Right.
bother with that? But blind people can buy shoes for their nephews, or for their spouse, or so all these things are possible as well. So the idea that people don't use that people with disabilities don't use technology could not be further from the truth today, especially considering the fact that with every passing year there's less and less possibilities of actually being serviced in person. Like, you have to use the web to those
Yep.
things,
Yep.
and everyone has to pay their taxes. Everyone has to do some banking. Everyone has to order something on Amazon. Everyone needs to do all these different things. So every time that someone runs into an issue where they can't actually do what they're trying to do, and they need to ask somebody else for help, it's a reminder to them that they don't really matter. So again, we're going back to the reputation. If I have a really hard time on your website trying to buy something, I'm going to tell people that I know how bad of an experience that was, and that can lead them to also decide, well, if that's the case, I'm also going to move to a different, a
Right.
competitor that actually cares about this and doesn't make you feel so excluded from society. So all these things really are part of it.